Studies major. This is my senior honors presentation on the ethics and aesthetics of dignity, art, human rights, and the humanities. And I'm going to talk about it. I had a very long paper that I realized I couldn't read to you today, so I made a shorter paper, which is still too long, so I'm just going to give an informal talk. Maybe I'll on that. So I cut out a lot, so if you experts in the room, forgive me if I generalize a little bit. So when I was in Vienna last year, I was walking in a park and a man came up to me, he was really haggard, looked like a homeless guy, so I was going to ask for money, and he came up to me and he started to ask me for human rights. He was bleeding from his neck and from his knuckles, and instead of asking me for money, he wanted human rights. He said, "Give me human rights. Do you have human rights? I want human rights." And I was sort of stunned by this. What do I say? I said, well, go to a lawyer, go to a hospital, they'll clean you up, they'll help you out. He said, no, I want human rights. So, how? What do I do? The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the UN passed in 1948. And there was a great bit of consternation at the time because they wondered, can there be such a thing as universal human rights? Well, they hired a philosopher, Jacques Maritain, to try to help think about this. He was a Catholic personalist philosopher. And Maritain helped them construct a survey that they sent out to people all over the world, people like Mahatma Gandhi, and asked, what are human rights? What is the basis for them? And surprisingly, there are universal human rights, but we don't know why, which is what Maritain says. Just don't ask us why. So they decided to go forward with an open foundation. They created this sort of document with 30 human rights, and they don't know what the philosophical basis is. And they were a little worried about this. They said we should come back to this and figure this out at some point, because how long can a boat without a bottom go before sinking? Dignity is the closest they get at defining the basis for human rights. The document begins with Article 1. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and in rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. So they've got a couple things going on here: reason, freedom, equality, brotherhood. And it's all tied together with this concept of dignity. Well, I find that interesting because dignity is as much an aesthetic and artistic concept, something we cultivate, as it is a political one. Maritain himself connected these. He writes, "No questions are more intricate than those which relate neither to art alone nor to ethics alone, but to art and ethics at the same time. The philosopher, who, at the risk of displeasing everybody, embarks on such questions, must take into account both the dignity and demands of the moral life and the dignity and liberty of art and poetry." So it's interesting, he connects the dignity of man that we find in ethics to the dignity of art as such, and practicing art for its own sake would somehow bring about this dignity. So that's very curious. So where are the origins of this? Where does this come from? One anecdote that's interesting is the anecdote of Solon and Thespis. Thespis, as you know, is the first actor ever, the Thespians. And there's a story about Solon, who went and saw Thespis perform his first plays. And Thespis had some innovations in theater at the time. He started to wear a mask, which in Latin was called a persona, or in Greek a prosopon. And he started, instead of narrating a story, he would act it out and embody these characteristics. Solon went and saw this and hated it. He said, after the play was done, he addressed Thespis and asked him if he was not ashamed to tell so many lies before such a number of people. And Thespis replying that it was no harm to do so in a play, Solon vehemently struck his staff against the ground and said, "Aye," he said, "if we honor and commend such plays in this, we shall soon find it someday in our business." And the business that he was talking about was politics. Solon was a politician. He was worried that art would make politicians liars. And what's even remarkable about this is there's a great deal of irony in Solon's phrase. Solon was himself an artist, he was a poet, and his poetic forms ended up being hugely influential in Greek tragedy afterwards. Furthermore, Solon was the founder of democracy. He invented this idea and was like, we should practice democracy. And democracy was based on theater, where they would meet in the theatron, and that's where they held this sort of assembly, because that was the only place big enough for people. And the critical body within Greek democracy was called the theoria. Theoria is from a Greek word which means to see, but it's not individual seeing, it's a sort of public type of seeing. So the theoria was like a jury which could officially see on behalf of the public. And when they started letting all of these, unwashed masses in democracy, they needed to reserve some official people who could speak for that public. So it was the theoria, and the word theoria comes from the people who were in the audience of the theater, the theatrum. So theater and art was the basis of democracy for so long. So it's interesting that he condemns it so much. And another interesting relationship between art and politics in ancient Greece was the so-called Greek miracle that occurred around the turn of the 5th century BC, where all of a sudden people started to represent the body using contrapposto. So I have an image here. Contrapposto. So all of a sudden, it's not just the sort of rigid sculptures before, but all of a sudden he was more relaxed and sort of this embodying of the human form in a more dignified and realistic way. Now, the turn of the 5th century was also when Solon's democracy finally took on. And a lot of scholars have scratched their chins about how come democracy and this realism in art happened at the same time. This sort of Greek miracle has also been called the power of Pygmalion. Pygmalion was a Greek myth about a sculptor who sculpted a beautiful woman, so beautiful and so realistic in the line of contrapposto, that he fell in love with it. And he tried to keep sculpting it better and better using art to bring it to life. And he failed until he prayed to Aphrodite, and Aphrodite came, brought it to life, and they got married. And that's why they call it, sculptures coming to life was the power of Pygmalion. I think Pygmalion also is a good metaphor for Greek classical education. The point of classical education was to cultivate virtues. In Latin they were called the humanitas, and one of the humanitas, which is where we get the word humanities and humanity, us, cultivating humanity, one of those virtues was dignity, which was a stylistic notion within rhetoric. And the idea was to cultivate dignity to make one better at the humanitas. But this dignity was not intrinsic. Instead, dignity was something that was merely a social status. It represented your rank there. And so there's nothing intrinsic about dignity or about personhood. In fact, again, persona was this theatrical notion that had to do with relationality. It's a role you play. And they applied that word persona both to theatrical roles and to political roles. But there's nothing intrinsic about being a person. So there was a shift in the 3rd century AD, where all of a sudden this contrapposto thing disappeared and people started to represent more symbolic art. Part of the reason for this shift is Plotinus, who said that who was deeply suspicious of images, just like Plato was. Plotinus said that images sort of corrupt. Instead, we should represent virtues and the humanitas with images. And so they stopped doing. They stopped representing people so realistically, and instead had these more sort of symbolic art. And they connected that again to this sort of Pygmalion idea of embodying virtues yourself. Plotinus himself said that we should aim to sculpt our bodies in the method of virtue. And what's interesting about this sort of 3rd century AD, when the shift in art happened, is it was connected to the Christian world. By this time, Christians had come onto the scene. And Christians in the early church were also very suspicious of images. They agreed with Plotinus that it shouldn't be about appearances, but about virtues. They also had this sort of Hebraic idea of idolatry. And this created a problem, though, for the early Christians, because Christ was incarnate. And so they were trying to figure out, what does the incarnation mean? Some people deny that Christ had a body at all. And there was a key shift that happened starting in the 3rd century, when the first images of Christ appeared, going forward, where suddenly Christ was depicted. Now, what happened that made this shift possible? Well, I think it's Tertullian. Tertullian was the person to first use the word Trinity in a text. Adversus praxeon, he used the word Trinity for the first time. So that's cool. He also used the word person in a philosophical sense for the first time in the same text. And that's interesting because today, humans and persons are synonyms. The idea that I'm a person, you're a person, we're all people, we know that. But in Tertullian's day, this wasn't so. Again, persona was an artistic term. And centuries later, Jeremy Bentham reflects on this tension. He says, personhood is a fiction. It's a legal fiction. The state says you're a person, or you're 3/5 of a person, maybe. So that's not really real. So then what is personhood? Well, maybe there's something in us that's intrinsic that approximates it. And this tension goes back to sort of Tertullian, who first made personhood something that was intrinsic. Specifically, it wasn't humans that were persons for Tertullian, it was God that were persons. He said that God was three persons in one substance. So the idea of a person comes from God. God is the first person, and we become a person afterwards. Not only that, but Tertullian came up with this idea in response to an artistic question about representing Christ. There was a big controversy around the incarnation and representation, because in Scripture it says that no one shall see God and live. No one can see the face of God, specifically, face, persona. No one can see the face of God and live. And yet it also says in Scriptures that Moses saw God face to face, persona to persona, and lived. And so how do we make sense of this contradiction? How do we make sense of the incarnation? Because that's what this contradiction is about. Well, Tertullian said, easy. There's one face that if you see you'll die, and there's another face if you see you'll live. God has more than one face. In fact, he has three faces, three persona in one substance. Now, maybe this sounds like modalism to you, which is what the Greeks thought. The Greek Christians say, hey, that's modalism. God has three faces? Now, Tertullian wrote that paper in response to the modalists, saying you're wrong, so it probably wasn't modalism for him. But the Greeks wanted to think about it a different way. They used two different terms. They said that God was three hypostasis in one ousia. Ousia means essence, sort of like being. Hypostasis, hypo means under, and stasis means to stand. So it's more like the substance. So they were like, you're saying he's three persons in one substance, and we're saying he's three substances in one essence. So how do we make sense of this? And the Latins saw the Greeks as heretics as well, because God's not three substances, he's only one. And they couldn't figure this out. Is God just this sort of three individuals, or is God one individual with three sort of manifestations? So how did they figure it out? Well, in 362, at the Synod of Alexandria, they all got together and they decided that they didn't have the right language to talk about God's personhood. The Greek term was too individualistic, and the Latin term was too relational. But there is no other concept. There's nothing that's not an individual, that's not in relation. And yet at the same time there's a tension, because a relation requires relata and the relations, and without either of those you don't get it. So what they decided to do was just make up a new concept. And they said hypostasis equals persona. They mistranslated it on purpose, just to represent this mystery they couldn't capture. And so for the first time you get this idea of a person that's neither an individual, nor certainly just something collective or a role. And this was God. Okay? So that's really interesting that this sort of invention came about. And the reason it's relevant to human rights is because the idea of a person is sort of the foundation. I'm persons, human rights are inherent in me, people should, and that affects the role that I play. People should behave in a certain way towards me because of that. So, historically, did this idea influence? Is that where human rights come from? Well, I think so. Athanasius was the guy who presided over the Synod in Alexandria in 362. And Athanasius had this really interesting idea, which was present in the other fathers as well. He said that God became man in the incarnation so that man could become God. That was a sort of formula for salvation that the early church taught. And Athanasius connected this to dignity of the human body. That God becomes man in the human form, the human body, and suddenly we have human bodies, and now that allows us to ascend to godhood. Well, what is godhood? Well, according to that synod, it's personhood. So the idea that God is a person, and we can become gods, which means that we can become persons too. And a contemporary of Athanasius was Leontis of Byzantium, who used the word in hypostasis to capture this. The idea that Christ was one in hypostasis, one person between God and man, and later Gregory Palamas said that's what it means to be saved. So this led to an iconographic tradition, if I can bring it up, where suddenly, because of the incarnation, images could be used. And so here we have an image of Christ with his, two natures sort of symbolized on two sides of the face. And the face was important, the persona. You look at it, and they had this idea that what you look at, what you see, is what you become. So you look at nice things, and you become that. it was the Cappadocians in particular who sort of led to this. The one Cappadocian father, Gregor of Nyssa, says, just as the custom is that those who fashion images of rulers, as well as expressing their features, express the imperial dignity of purple garments, and it is customarily called both image and emperor, so too human nature, since it is fashioned to rule everything else, is set up as a kind of living image, participating in its archetype both in dignity and in name, the name of God, person, and this is connected to an intrinsic quality of human dignity, the ability to make icons of people and of Christ. Skipping ahead, the Renaissance marked a return to a number of these ideas. It was about the time of the Italian Renaissance, and Gregory Palamas said that in hypothesis applies to us as well. And the Renaissance was marked by a return to Greek classics and to patristic texts in particular. The Renaissance started in Florence in Italy, and Florence was also the site of the Council of Florence, which was in the 15th century when the Greek Orthodox and the Roman Catholics came together like, we should be one church again. And this brought a lot of Byzantine scholars over to the West and inspired all the Western people to say, hey, we should, have a Renaissance based on these Renaissance ideas of humanism, humanitas. And the idea behind the Renaissance was fundamentally artistic. It said, let's create an educated populace through art and architecture, the studia humanitas, they invented that term, the study of the humanities. And this was given an ideological underpinning by Pico de Mirandola. So Pico de Mirandola wrote the Oration on the Dignity of Man. And his idea of dignity was that God created everything in the world, and after creating it all, he needed someone to sort of look at it and appreciate it. And who was this person, or who was the thing that would do that? Well, humanity. And so for the first time, for Mirandola, man doesn't have a place in the great chain of being. It doesn't have a role to play. Prior to that, the idea of dignity came from Cicero and this idea of cultivating your role. Instead, and cultivating dignity was part of the humanitas. For Mirandola, dignity was the fundamental thing. It wasn't just something that sort of came out of the humanitas. The humanitas came out of dignity. The idea that man no longer has a role means that man can create artistically his own roles, his own freedom. And this freedom that is afforded us is the foundation of the studius humanitas. This sort of idea of dignity as a part of human nature led to a Renaissance revival in art to try to cultivate these things. In particular, here's one of the people inspired by the Renaissance was Albert Dürer. Here he has a self-portrait, and you can see the iconographic Byzantine overtones in this. Suddenly, ordinary humans can embody in their own body these virtues that we're looking for. Another one of the products of the Renaissance was the Iconologia by Cesare Rocca. This was a book, Iconologia, again, icons, a book of different images of the human body in different classical poses. The idea is that we're supposed to look at this and be inspired to be a moral, humanistic, dignified person. So the Renaissance didn't really succeed. It was a bunch of, sort of stuck-up Italians in Italy who didn't really filter down to the public. There wasn't a propagation of human rights. Their vision failed. But their vision inspired an artistic movement. It failed politically, but artistically it succeeded. It succeeded in the 18th century, 1700s, when people decided to talk about art for the first time. See, art as a category of thought, as a practice, as a thing we do, wasn't invented until the 18th century. In the 18th century, you get people distinguishing the fine arts, painting, sculpture, architecture, from other sort of mechanical arts, crafts, things that people work with their hands. Before that, art and craft and artisanship and sort of making things were all together. And artists, even in the Renaissance, didn't have that much sort of value within society. They were, people who made things with their hands. Who cares about them? And in the 18th century, people were like, hey, art's this thing that exists and that we can do, and it's its own discipline, an end in itself. And sort of, echoing Marathon here. And it was started in the 1730s. People talked about fine art for the first time. They used words like taste and sensibility. And sensibility here didn't just mean sort of sensation, but this thing that was in you, a capacity for recognizing beauty and virtue, and it's intrinsic to us. And through art, we cultivate the sensibility. So that went on the 1730s, it started. And public spaces for this, museums and salons, where you go in and you look at a painting on a wall and you stare at it reverently, iconographically. These existed. And people started to have public musical performances. It wasn't just the kings who heard music at festivals, but everyone could go to a concert hall and hear a musical piece. Or you could go see a play. And people's behavior shifted because these artists tried to teach people how to behave towards art. So instead of sort of shouting and jeering and like having these huge visceral reactions to plays and to art, instead people went into theaters and they sat down and they quietly stared at the play the entire time and didn't make any noises, which is what we do now. But it was an invention. Another thing that came about was the epistolary novel. The idea, it was sort of collections of letters that became the novel. And these were hugely popular. They were meant to cultivate this sensibility. And these epistolary novels also weren't narratives with the voice of an author going, and then this happened. Instead, it was an epistle, someone writing in their own voice. And it wasn't, a great Greek hero that was writing his own voice, it was some common person. And suddenly you could identify with them through the sensibility and create what's called sympathy. The idea that you can see the world through their point of view. And scholars think that this is deeply connected to a trend that happened starting in the 1750s, which was the idea that of human rights and of inherent dignity. Specifically, in the 1750s, people started worrying about torture. Before that, people tortured other people. It was a terrible thing, but no one reflected on it. Every time the word torture was used, it was like, oh, I have tortured thoughts, not tortured bodies. And suddenly, after this idea of sympathy and sensibility and putting yourself in another person's place, people start talking about, hey, we shouldn't torture other people. That's a bad idea. And it became so popular, this idea of not torturing, that by the end of the 18th century, it was sort of dogmatic. Torture is just bad. Let's not do that. And Kant summarized all of this at the end of that century, where he wrote famous books both on art, the critique of judgment, and on politics, the critique of practical reason. And he connected these trends. He said that man is an end in himself. Man has this inherent dignity that we ought to honor in ethics. And that's the basic of all ethics, sort of humans. He also said that art was in some sense an end in itself. He said that art was purposiveness without purpose. So it had this purposive element to it, but it wasn't created for some purpose, for some thing it was supposed to accomplish. It was just sort of there, an expression of human dignity. And he connected these two. He said that the human body is the ideal of beauty. And what he meant by this was the human body has a purposiveness to it, ready to act. Yet there's no inherent purpose. It gives its own purposes. The human is free and autonomous and can set for themselves what they want to do, fulfilling the vision of Pico de Mirandola, who said that the humans have this sort of freedom and we express our dignity through this fundamental freedom. So that's really interesting. And where did all of this start? Well, in the 1730s, this guy named Baumgarten invented a school of thought called aesthetics. And this was sort of sensibility and taste and all these sort of things. And where did Baumgarten get this idea of aesthetics? Well, partly he looked to the Renaissance, but that's not what he said. In his book, he said that he was reading the Greek church fathers and the Greek classics. And from them, they had this idea of aesthesis, which is a type of seeing. In sort of Christianity, you start with aesthesis, this private seeing, and it brings you into contemplation, which is theoria, which I mentioned earlier, looking at an icon, and it transforms you. And we said this idea of aesthesis, we can found a discipline around that, call it aesthetics. And suddenly, you get political change as well. And leading to the French Revolution, where you get this declaration of the rights of man and of the citizen. But it wasn't Kant that inspired the French Revolution, because he was, contemporaneous with him. It was this guy named Rousseau. Now, Rousseau is particularly interesting in the context of our discussion, because Rousseau hated art. He became famous for his first discourse, which was, they posted a public question. What do you think about the revival of arts? Isn't that great for society? And he said, no, it's terrible. Art degrades public morality. It teaches, it just destroys everything. Greek civilization fell because they practiced art. And in particular, he hated theater. Because in theater, you go up on stage and you act like someone you're not. And then you're a spectator and you look at people and there's no sympathy there. It's just, pure voyeurism. And also, he hated the idea of human rights. He didn't like to talk about rights. So it's very interesting that he then inspired human rights. What's even more interesting is that Rousseau himself was the most prominent aesthetician of the 18th century. He was part of he wrote the Encyclopedia along with Diderot and several others, which was the authoritative text of aesthetics. And he was in particular famous for writing about music. It's very ironic because his idea of social contract, he wrote that book, Social Contract, comes from music. He said social contract was an expression of what he called the general will. The general will was this sort of public recognition. It's the thing that the theoria might embody in ancient Greece. And when he first describes this, he talks about, imagine a bunch of musicians sitting on stage together. They can create sort of together and feel this thing called rhythm and create a thing called harmony. This is what I call the general will. And this is what politics is based on in the social contract. So just like Solon before him, who hated art and this idea of acting, Rousseau also hated it and then used artistic terminology to describe this new political theory. For Solon it was democracy, for Rousseau it led to human rights. What's even more interesting is that Rousseau himself was a famous playwright and musician and artist, and he wrote novels. And one play in particular was hugely possible, and it was called Pygmalion. I have an image of Pygmalion here. He wrote this play called Pygmalion. Here's, again, the statue that comes to life, right? Which is our metaphor for human rights and for art. Only for him, he took God out of the equation, where instead this person's Pygmalion succeeds in bringing Galatea to life through the practice of arts, the supreme triumph of arts. And what was particularly at issue in this play for him, she came to life and she looked at him and recognized him. And it was from her point of view, suddenly the shift happened. And she said, me, not me, me. This idea of sympathy, of recognition of another, that led to, abolishing torture. And again, shifting from the man's point of view to the woman who's created through art. That's very interesting that Rousseau would write a play like this. Especially since, and I'm not the first person to recognize this, there's a lot of tensions in Rousseau. Rousseau's fundamental notion, the reason that he hated theater was because he had this idea of the amour de soi, the love of self, as this exalted thing where I recognize my own freedom and dignity, and etc. And he thought theater cultivated amour propre, which is the idea of a self-love that's mediated by others, where I view myself through the eyes of others, and this is sort of inauthentic. Etymologically, we can see that this idea of the theatrical role being a social thing through others' eyes, that was the Greek persona. That's why Solon hated it so much. Instead, we should have this intrinsic freedom. And here with the two self-loves in Rousseau, we have a tension between the intrinsic nature of dignity and of human rights and the public nature that human rights don't come about until we declare them, which is why we have so many declarations of human rights. And so Robespierre loved Rousseau. He thought his art was great, his ideas were great, brought about the French Revolution, and they had this mantra, liberté, égalité, fraternité, which can correspond to Rousseau's idea of this sort of intrinsic self-love, liberty, that I recognize in myself. This egalitarian sympathy I see with others, and this fraternity, the general will which comes about and instantiates these ideas. Interestingly enough, that these three have also been correlated with what's called the three generations in human rights. Starting with the French Revolution going forward, there were three major sort of leaps ahead in human rights. The first one was classical liberalism, libertarian ideas of human rights based on civil liberties and freedom. this came about, and then all of a sudden, the people who had liberty and freedom, who could vote, wasn't everyone. There were people who were economically disadvantaged, slaves, men without property rights, women. And this economic situation led to them not having human rights. So you had a second group which came along and said, oh, well, we need economic rights as well. These were called socialists, the idea of social and economic liberty. And then once you had that, that sort of came about, then you had a third group which said, well, even with that, there's still people who are left out. Particularly colonialism invited a lot of this, and whole peoples, the idea of a general public, have rights as well. And this was called the third generation, rights of self-determination, communal rights, the idea that my community shouldn't be subjugated to someone else. And these three generations correspond to liberté, égalité, fraternité, the three artistic virtues that Rousseau talked about as well. And what's interesting is that these three also had artistic underpinnings. Just like with Rousseau, his idea of liberty and something we cultivate within us led to this expansion of, hey, we have liberty, we should declare it, we should have revolutions. So did each of these other stages have this artistic vision that opens up a new space, and then out of that new space comes social change, art creating politics. The second generation of human rights, the socialist human rights, one of the responded to the 18th century artistic trends. Before Marx wrote his stuff on communism, he commented on art in the 1840s. And he said that this idea of fine art as autonomous discipline is a bad idea. We should get rid of this. Because what it does is it separates fine, like laborers, people in factories, the economic stuff, from these high-class people who do rights. They talk about human rights and about liberty and art, and then it's built on this edifice of factory workers. And so Marx's idea was we should reunify the arts and the artisans, arts and craftsmanship. And that art should just be one of the things that's done by everyone. And Marx didn't get famous for this idea, but one person who did was John Ruskin. Ruskin was one of the preeminent Victorian social reformers, very famous. He talked about, he didn't use the word socialist so much, because that wasn't really a term that was well defined, but he was a social reformer, talked to people in factories, talked about social and economic rights, wrote Unto This Last, which is this idea of liberating the common people. Also, Ruskin was a famous artist and aestheticist. He founded the Ruskin School of Fine Arts and Design at Oxford University, and he wrote Modern Painters, which is sort of a survey of art history, and hugely influential both in arts and in politics. And his idea was the reunification of arts and crafts. And he founded what was called the Arts and Crafts movement, where you have craftsmen and artists coming together. The dignity of a craftsman is that he is an artist. He can engage in fine, intricate designs, and here you have the craftsman and the artist unified together. And this idea was fundamentally an artistic ideal for Ruskin, which promoted social reform. Interestingly, Ruskin and Morris, who was another big guy who founded this with him, were influenced by Byzantine art during the Renaissance. His Venetian, The Stones of Venice, was that big book that inspired Ruskin and Morris to go down this path about Byzantine art in Venice, which Venice used to be part of the Byzantine Empire before it fell during the Uxorcate. And so with the second wave of human rights, you get people like Ruskin talking about the craftsman ideal, and you get people like Victor Hugo talking about, Les Miserables, the sort of ordinary, economically disadvantaged people, and they're being exalted in their dignity. Victor Hugo says that to love another person is to see the face, persona, of God. Now, this led to a bunch of reforms, to universal suffrage. Originally, the socialists didn't care so much about creating a communist utopia. What socialists cared about was universal suffrage and, for example, slavery. Marx was hugely influential in the founding of the Republican Party in the United States and wrote in the sort of National Review, which was their big newspaper, and organized an international solidarity movement which kept Britain out of the Civil War and allowed the North to defeat the South. Because this idea of slaves, they're laborers who are oppressed by this upper aristocratic class. So this sort of suffrage and socialist causes. But even with those reforms, people were still left out. Marx was an internationalist. We should all join this one big party, international party, and that sort of covers over the idea of developing a people. And so people responded to the socialist right with the third generation of human rights. And this third generation itself had artistic underpinnings. So one person that I should mention here is Oscar Wilde. Oscar Wilde responded to Ruskin and said, no, all these guys are wrong, socialists are wrong. Art shouldn't just teach morality. Art should be an end in itself, harking back to Kant. He popularized the term art for art's sake. So Wilde sounds like the ultimate sort of decadent guy who doesn't care about politics. But that's wrong. Oscar Wilde was an active political thinker. He wrote a book called an essay called The Soul of Man Under Socialism. And he didn't mean socialism in the sort of Marxist socialism. He was a libertarian socialist, the idea of liberty and socialism coming together. And what is the soul of man under socialism? Well, the soul of man under socialism is artistic. The reason that we need socialism, for Wilde, is so that we can do art. Because if art's an end in itself, then we should organize the polis, the civilization, around the creation of art. And interestingly, you would think that Wilde is disagreeing with Ruskin here, but a number of scholars have noted that Wilde is actually saying the same thing Ruskin is. Here, let me quote from Wilde. Wilde wrote an essay called The Decay of Lying, in which he advocated for artistic lying. His basic idea was that artists invent these concepts, and they sort of take over. And the idea was that life imitates art more than art imitates life. Art doesn't imitate life. We don't create sculptures based on things in the world. Rather, it is life, human life, which imitates art. We embody these classical ideals in the humanities. We ourselves are the statue of Pygmalion, who go on to imitate these artistic ideals. And Wilde says, no great artist ever sees things as they really are. If he did, he would cease to be an artist. Take an example from our own day. I know that you are fond of Japanese things. Now, do you really imagine that the Japanese people, as they are presented to us in art, have any existence? If you do, you have never understood Japanese art at all. The Japanese people are the deliberate and self-conscious creation of certain individual artists. That's very provocative. But I think his idea was on something. This idea of this humanistic, artistic ideal that we embody, that shapes politics and life, is what the story I've been telling. Furthermore, people have noted that The Decay of Lying is basically a Ruskinian treatise. He takes what Ruskin says about art and then adds some sort of provocative witticisms to it, but the same basic argument. Ruskin said, the greatest thing a human soul ever does in this world is to see something and to tell it, and tell what it saw in a plain way. Hundreds of people can talk for one who can think, but thousands can think for one who can see. To see clearly is poetry, prophecy, and religion all in one. So the vision of the artist is equivalent to the thoughts of thousands of people, because the artist sees something and tells it what he sees, this beautiful lie, as Wilde would say, and suddenly thousands of people start thinking that way, and politics reorganizes. You have a craftsman ideal, and all of a sudden you get labor movements. Basically, what he's talking about is the transition from aesthesis to theoria, from this sort of private appreciation of art to the general will of Rousseau. So this aestheticism, the movement that Wilde was part of, and then Ruskin's art and craft movement, at first glance, seem to be opposed, but in fact, they're actually on the same page. They were part of a broader movement in Europe at the time called the Symbolist movement. The Symbolist Manifesto was written by a guy named Jean Mauriac, who was a friend of Wilde's, and Of course, Jean Moyas was himself from Greece. His birth name was Ioannis Papadimopoulos. And so again, we have Greek ideas coming over, shaping artistic movements in Europe, leading to human rights. Another big influence of Wilde was Leo Tolstoy, another originally Russian Orthodox thinker, leader of the church. Tolstoy wrote a book called What is Art? He says, like Rousseau and so on before him, that art is worthless and morally degrading. Ironic, given the amount of art that Tolstoy himself produced. Then he says that we should have an art that teaches Christian ideas, which again is ironic, given I've been arguing this whole time that art has been teaching Christian ideas for all these centuries. So again, like Rousseau and so on before him, he has this political idea. We're going to get rid of art and instead do politics. And we're going to use art for political goals, while himself actually being a victim of art, and his politics being a victim of art. Tolstoy was part of this big third wave of human rights. He was a back-to-the-land guy, agrarian. He wasn't a socialist. An idea that we should all live together and the peasants should come together. He himself started dressing like a peasant, so much so that the peasant garment that he wore came to be called a Tolstoyevka, which is what I'm wearing now. Why I'm dressed this way. And so, is this, what I'm wearing, is this a political statement? Or is this a fashion statement? Well, it's ambiguous. Ruskinians also started to found these utopian communities, built around arts and crafts. And they taught sensibility. They had sort of public education days where you could come in and learn arts and crafts, which is how that sort of came into be in education. Strangely enough, Morris and Ruskin didn't like this development. They weren't utopian communalists. So this marked a shift away from socialist human rights to communal human rights. An example of a Ruskinian who found this was Jane Addams, who founded the Hull House in Chicago, also the founder of social work. And what did they do with the Hull House? Well, in the beginning, yeah, they had people come over and do social work, but she spent most of her time talking about Ruskin and arts and crafts. And the people over, it's like, let's discuss the art of Ruskin. Another person that was inspired by this is Mahatma Gandhi, who said that the two most biggest influences of his life was Ruskin and Tolstoy. Here you have Gandhi, also dressed in the garb of a peasant. He stopped wearing suits, started dressing that way. And he was spin. He would weave his own cloth for like 4 hours a day or something, every day, which is an idea he got from these Ruskinian utopian communities. They would come and they would spin, like spinning was a huge thing for them. And all of a sudden Gandhi's doing spinning. And so much so that this emblem is now on the Indian flag. Furthermore, Gandhi, when he was in South Africa, started an ashram, a community, and he named it after Tolstoy. And he and Tolstoy exchanged letters. And Tolstoy suggested to Gandhi that, if India leads a mass nonviolence campaign, you can achieve independence from the Britons. Well, he was right. This artistic idea, led to social change. And this is the third generation of human rights. The idea that the community, the Indians, have the right to self-determination, these communal rights. Another person who was involved in this was Picasso. Picasso, founder of Cubism. This is Guernica. This was an image supposed to make a commentary on the Spanish Civil War and about international attention to the Spanish Civil War. Picasso famously was inspired by El Greco, the Greek. And you can see sort of iconographic depictions in his art. When Guernica was first exhibited, here's what went along with it. We are fighting for the essential unity of Spain. We are fighting for the integrity of Spanish soil. We are fighting for the independence of our country and for the right of Spanish people to determine our own destiny. Here again, determining our own destiny, it's a dignity idea from Mirandola, only this time it's not an individual, it's a community. Another person I should mention here is Hugo Ball, who was another avid political activist, who was also an artist, wrote the Dadaist Manifesto. Hugo Ball, interestingly, before he wrote the Dadaist Manifesto, wrote a book called Byzantine Christianity. And Dadaism, it is speculated, is from Dionysius, the Areopagite, which was the main subject of Byzantine Christianity, one of these early Greek fathers who talked about hypostasis and personas, those sort of things. So there's part of my argument, this big sort of three waves of art leading to three ways of human rights. But there was a flip side to this. Like I said, every time there was a new wave of human rights, there was a backlash. Napoleon, then World War I, then World War II. Adolf Hitler. Looking back to art and Greek ideals. For Hitler, he didn't care about individual rights, liberty, none of that stuff. He was cared about communal rights, German rights, and he looked back to Greek sculpture, and we should embody those ideals in an Aryan people. So, this led to a crisis in the 1930s among a group of French intellectuals which called themselves the personalists. They had this idea of the human person, which is where I started. And Mournier, the famous personalist who published the Personalist Journal, said, "We are neither individualists nor collectivists. We are personalists." And this is the intention I started with, between hypostasis and persona. Both sides are a way to fail. And the human rights before him fail in one way or the other. And so they had this idea of persona, of person, as the foundation of new human rights. So Berdyaev, Nikolai Berdyaev, was a Russian Orthodox theologian who was hugely influential in this. Berdyaev, in the 20s, started to have people over to his house for Berdyaev Sundays, where they would all discuss personalism. Berdyaev got his idea of personalism from the Russian Orthodox thinkers. So again, the Byzantines, and these ideas I started with are having an effect. Here's a quote from Berdyaev. "The ego remains isolated as long as it can only commune with the object. Its solitude can only be vanquished by the communion of personalities, of the ego and the thou in the innermost depths of the we." Now with this ego, thou, and we, he brings together the liberty, the equalite, and the fraternite. These three generations of human rights, starting with self-recognition of my own freedom, mutual recognition of the dignity of other, and public recognition of our communal rights. That's what the personalists talked about. And this, they said that these, and it's important to note that these three types of recognition, the first person, second person, the third person, are all basically recognition of the same thing. Essentially, they're all just recognizing dignity in the first person, the second person, the third person. And my phrasing there was intentional. It's the same essential recognition in three persons. So the idea was very Trinitarian, egalite, or liberté, egalite, fraternité, first person, second person, third person recognition of essence of dignity. This idea of imitating the Trinity and the personhood of the Trinity is the foundation of our personhood and what it means to be human. And they were explicit about that. This, harkens back to man became God, so God could become man. And man became God in the human body. And so they had this idea that our bodies, that we are persons, that we could incarnate these ideas of human rights and of personhood in ourselves. And it's important to note, this wasn't just some metaphysical speculation. This was artistic and political. It's notable that this discovery, or that this innovation, comes along with an artistic movement called the rediscovery of icons. So at the turn of the century, when the personalists started to talk about these things, there was a return to iconography. The tradition, in the Eastern Orthodox tradition, had forgotten icons, and they were suddenly rediscovered. And so here we have Mother Maria Skobtsova, a famous social reformer, had a house of hospitality in Paris. She was an icon painter. And Picasso, I've mentioned, had iconographic elements, and the people who patronized the rediscovery of icon also loved Picasso's paintings. And And so what's interesting is there's a trend in art where you start with the realism of the sort of Romantics and the Renaissance and of the Pygmalion shift in ancient Greece. Then it becomes more symbolic with the symbolist movement, or Plotinus' idea of symbolizing virtue. And then finally it culminates in icons, the rediscovery of icons in the 20th century and the origin of icons in the 5th and 6th centuries. And that this artistic movement, culminating in icons, where you contemplate the face of the human body, also culminated with the two big innovations in personhood, the invention of the word person with Tertullian, and the invention of personalism with Berdyaev. So, is my argument then that these personalists, these artists, these Renaissance classical thinkers, these theater people, that somehow their ideas created the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that the lawyers and diplomats and sort of politicians that wrote that document were somehow influenced by these artistic trends? That's not what I'm saying, because lawyers and diplomats and politicians didn't write the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The person who wrote the first draft was John Peters Humphrey. Here's a quote from his biography. During the 1930s, Humphrey was considered a Renaissance man, with the majority of his interest in education, the arts, and the humanities. In addition to him, there were two main people who were the philosopher-architects of the UDHR. One was Pen Zhongchang, who was the preeminent playwright and theatrical director of China. And the second person is Charles Malik. Charles Malik is this incredible figure, one of the most popular thinkers of the 20th century. He was awarded 63 honorary doctorates. And yet we've mostly forgotten him. Who was Charles Malik? Well, he was an Eastern Orthodox theology professor. And he was the chief philosopher-architect of UDHR, also famously a personalist. And I already mentioned Jacques Maritain's role in all of this, another personalist thinker connected to Mounier and Berdyaev. And when they structured the UDHR, they had it in three sections. It starts with Article 1, which I mentioned, which had to do with liberty. Then the next section is about liberty and freedom. Then the next section is equal social rights. And the third section is communal rights. The Trinitarian ideal embodied in society. Personalism didn't just inspire human rights, it also inspired people like Martin Luther King Jr., Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who got his doctorate writing about personalism, or Dorothy Day, who started the Catholic worker movement. They were inspired explicitly by Mounier. And an associate of Dorothy Day's once told me, I asked, how did Dorothy Day do it? And he said, because she could see beauty in every human face, no matter how distorted it was. This brings to mind Thomas Merton, an avid reader of Mounier, and someone who was a close associate of Dorothy Day. He writes in his journals, in Louisville, the corner of 4th and Walnut, in the center of the shopping district, I was suddenly overwhelmed with the realization that I loved all these people, that they were mine and I theirs, and that we could not be alien to one another, even though we were total strangers. It was like waking from a dream of separateness, of spurious self-isolation in a special world. The sense of liberation from an illusory difference was such a relief and such a joy to me that I almost laughed out loud. I had the immense joy of being a man, a member of a race in which God himself became incarnate. As if the sorrows and stupidness of the human condition could overwhelm me, now I realize that what we all are. And if only everybody could realize this. But it cannot be explained. There is no way of telling people that they are walking about shining like the sun. Then it was suddenly as if I saw the secret beauty in their hearts, the depths of their hearts in which neither sin, nor desire, nor self-knowledge can reach, the core of their reality, the person that each one is in God's eyes. If only they could all see themselves as they really are. If only we could see each other that way all the time, there would be no more war, no more hatred, no more cruelty, no more greed. A vision of universal human rights based on seeing, Trinitarian, incarnate, the vision of the human. And if he is right, I think this idea of a human person will have huge effects. the way that we organize our political schema will have to change, because we've only just begun to understand what it means to be a person, and only just begun to embody it in society. The universal human rights aren't universally practiced. So, this brings me to the Merton quote brings to mind the famous passage in Dostoevsky's The Idiot, where Prince Michigan is confronted by a fellow who says, "Are you a Christian? Do you really believe that beauty will save the world?" And then he laughs at this and says, "Which beauty will save the world?" Well, it's well known that Dostoevsky was very influential on the people of Wilde and social reform at that time period. And if anything that I've said today is true, then perhaps it is the beauty of the human and divine communion, incarnate, Trinity incarnate, in the human body and dignity that will save the world. So we have this room for another 15 minutes. Or you can leave. You're going to save the world.
One thing that you said kind of struck home with me, that to me, public politics is the same as performance art.
Yeah.
It's entirely the same thing, and that there is, and also on a much greater sphere, there is no such thing as a social movement that doesn't have art, an artistic dimension of demonstration, creativity, and power.
Yeah, I mean, the idea of performance in my longer paper I reflect on. In ordinary language philosophy, they distinguish between what's called a performative and a constantive. A performative is something in language that does something. Insofar as I say I'm in a relationship with someone and they say it back, it happens. And then a constantive is just a mere description. And I think there's a paradox in human rights where we have to declare them. We have to say, we are persons, human rights are there, you know, or maybe we only say someone's 3/5 of a person. But the declarative and the performative element is essential. Only when we say it and present it artistically does it come about. And yet, what are we declaring and performing? The idea of intrinsic human rights. Something that can't just be defined and invented by culture. It's something intrinsic and God-given. And I think this paradox is what motivated the personalists to say we're neither collectivists, it is something performative, nor are we individualists. It's not purely something that's just intrinsic and everyone recognizes. But there's this paradoxical idea of human rights and of personhood that we've inherited today in the world.
Rob, go ahead and I'll follow you.
I'll follow you.
Oh, okay.
Honor your dignity.
Okay. Well, I was trying to honor yours too.
He's a superhero.
Exactly. Nick, you're only one of about 5 or 6 undergrad students I've ever taught that I would ask this question. Did you encounter or read John Milbank's Theology and Social Theory?
I haven't read it, but
you know of it. Okay, good. I'm intrigued because you just created a masterful narrative of kind of a genealogical unfolding. But Milbank's narrative is a narrative of decline, a decline into secular reason, that modern Western Enlightenment is a matter of heretical modifications or rejections of Christian positions. So if your argument is right, and I find it rather persuasive, that in some sense a meaningful understanding of human rights is ultimately and finally grounded in a deep Trinitarian imagination and vision, that only in this way do we hold together the I, the thou, and the we, liberty, liberty, equality, fraternity.
Yeah.
What do we do then in trying to, as you mentioned as your opening problematic, what do we do when we're trying to make universal human rights function according to a secular reasoning, trying to ground these outside of what modernity would call a particularistic tradition, is how they would name the Christian tradition. If this is anchored in this very specific story of the way things are, the Christian story, and the unfolding development of Christian theology, then how does it come to function out? How does it unmoor itself from this and try to give itself another foundation if you're trying to do this secularly?
Right, good question. I mean, that was part of the motivation for this talk. There's discussions right now going on in the Eastern Orthodox Church with struggling with human rights, can we justify them, and a lot of fear that this is sort of secularism.
Yeah.
And my position is that no, human rights is a Christian idea insofar as everyone believes that humans are persons, which again is sort of, they're synonyms now. They're believing a Christian doctrine, the fundamental Christian doctrine, the personhood of Christ. And so I don't have an answer about how to adjudicate, like property rights versus communal rights versus national rights or whatever. But the story I want to tell, the reason I want to tell the story is because I'm in favor of modern secular, human rights. I think it's a Christian idea that we should all embrace. And what we're seeing historically is the embodiment of Christian ideas, what the church fathers predicted, that if we see this, it shall come to pass. And I think God works in mysterious ways and manifests these Trinitarian doctrines even in spite of ourselves. So as far as what to do practically, I don't know. I mean, I'm in favor of the arts, the humanities, education, theology, and I think we should defend those.
I was wondering, how would you respond to this sort of simple idea of grounded in human dignity? That I was thinking when you said Christian, I was thinking like a Jewish thinker might offer something like this. Is first of all, if you like in Plato, you believe that we have a soul, and so that's prior to this belief in a personhood, and a soul, which would be you have freedom, moral responsibility, rationality. That's all in place. And then you add to that Genesis 1, where we're created in the image of God, and then you reflect on that, and this would all be part of course, Jewish thought. We're created in the image of God, and so being created in the image of God, that itself gives human beings dignity, and where that then resides in particular is what's uniquely human, as for example Aristotle would say about our rationality or our freedom, because we're morally responsible agents, and our ability to be in relationship with each other. So you can do this whole thing without referring to the Trinity at all.
Sure. In my bigger paper, I talk about Plato and Aristotle and those things. There's no people who argue that the Christian idea of personhood isn't really found in them, not until you get this hypostatic personification. But regardless of the actual history of it, if someone wants to justify human rights the way I've described it without Christianity, that's fine with me. I mean, the Peng Chun-chan, the playwright, was himself a Confucian. And he was a neo-Confucianist, so Confucius himself wouldn't have human rights in the way he thought, but he brought in these personalist ideas and said, you can find these Confucius, we construct these as well. And even if that is the case, if a Jewish person or a Confucian wants to say it in that way, I still think, I'm fine with that. Because my fundamental point is personhood is neither individual nor collective, and embodying that requires three types of recognition of dignity, one in essence in three persons. And if you can justify that outside of Christianity, that's great. I would see that as what St. Justin Martyr said, the spermatologos, the idea of Christianity that's inherent in all world faiths.
A question regarding Emmanuel Levinas.
Sure.
And I wondered how you might incorporate it into your notion of personal
Yes.
I was wondering, first of all, whether the notion of recognition of the face is essential to the notion of human dignity.
Yes.
And if so, how is it possible to abstract that recognition into the form of law, into the form of a language or a principle that can be applied to all people, if the act of recognition is fundamentally something that occurs between the subject and the face of the other?
Yeah, so Levinas wrote Ethics in the Face, with the idea that the fact that we can see the faces of others gives us this notion of like, wow, I shouldn't hurt them. I have an obligation to them this truth. I just feel viscerally when I recognize the other face. A very sort of iconographic argument. And I think there's an interesting tension here where there's three types of recognition. Self-recognition of my own liberty and freedom that requires me to therefore use that liberty for moral purposes. And then recognition of another face, which is mutual recognition, the second person, which then requires me to act with honor towards them, even if they fail to be moral. No matter how immoral they get, we shouldn't just needlessly murder them. And the third type is this sort of extrapolating it to humanity. The idea of public recognition that personhood is something that we all have, something that we have to declare. And these three recognitions of dignity and personhood are different. And maybe they're even in tension. Maybe the Trinity is a paradox. I'm willing to buy that. In which case, I don't know how to reconcile it. I wouldn't reconcile it. I'd be like the church fathers who say, this is a mystery, it's a paradox, but it's fundamental. It's how we're going to shape the world, how we're going to live our lives. And I think that is what's happened historically.
Can you say something about what's the relationship between, let me pull my thought first. What's the relationship between personhood and subjectivity? And what happens if we add into the mix the idea that not just human beings have subjectivity or possibly personhood, but animals and living things and, that we're more like there's an organism that's beyond just the human community?
Right.
How would you talk
Sure,
about that?
That's subjectivity is one of the ways that people go to describe human rights as the foundation of what makes you a person, that I have inner private experiences. Again, that idea of an inner private experience was an 18th century idea, invented by artists developing the sensibility. I think this belongs to the first type. First, I recognize my own subjectivity, and then the second type is I recognize the subjectivity of another. And philosophers get hung up on that. Can we know other minds? It's more a mystery and a rule for acting, or a sort of religious artistic idea than it is a philosophical one that we can pin down. And how that relates to these questions on the borders. So there's the abortion debate. When people talk, if you type in personhood today into Google, all the articles are going to be abortion. I'm not going to be able to talk about. And this does come in because you can't look a fetus in the face, and they can't self-recognize. And so the question is, do we publicly recognize personhood or not? And we can't tell. And the same thing with